Oh, it's been a long day. I'm still a working stiff. I work full time. My days start about 7 a.m. How many are working here still? Are you guys all retired?
Sorry, don't have time for work. Too busy.
Couple more years, but who's counting? 2.5 more years. So I'm Daniel Ketchum. We haven't been properly introduced. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and we sponsor this event every month. We took a little 2-year hiatus there, but sure feels good to be back in action here. We actually met last month. We had a little bit smaller crowd. That's okay. We're going to be on the roll. If the infection rates continue downward, which we hope, we'll actually have some refreshments over there next month. And maybe we can leave the mask at home next month. That's what we're planning on. It is renewal time for those of you who haven't upped your renewal for 22. I've got a list of about 65 people that haven't renewed, so I've got a lot of phone calling to do. Costs $30 a year if you're not joined yet, and you get quarterly editions of our newsletter, the bulletin, and the headlines from the Railroad Museum. If you'll notice, there's color images. We've gone big time now, and we even have color images in our newsletter. Can you imagine that? Wow. So we're really moving right along. The next newsletter is in production, as is the bulletin. So, upcoming information, we have a couple open board members positions we like. We're missing a board secretary, so I'm kind of doing double duty during board meetings of running a meeting and keeping minutes. So I'd love to share that with somebody if you feel inclined to help us out with that. Our meetings are the second Thursday of most every other month. We've been kind of, don't have them quite so frequently anymore, but if you're inclined to come sit in a board meeting, it's at the Cyril's Library, 4 o'clock on the second Thursday of the month. Is that right? So, Pat, any news from the Cyril's you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, the city has agreed to allow us to expand into the adjoining room. The library has been so popular and thought so much of since we moved to the new facility that donations have really gone up in materials. And we're running out of file cabinet space and shelving and so on. And there is an 800 square foot room adjacent to it that needs to have a roll-up door removed and a wall put in and ceiling the lights and so forth. And the city has approved us doing that. And we're having plans drawn by the architect and the engineers.
Which we're waiting for the architect.
And we're starting to collect funds to help with the building. So anybody that wants to, we'll be glad to talk to you about donations.
And you're open Monday through Saturday, 1 to 4, so come for a tour or use the library.
Yeah.
Okay. Kathy, where's Kathy?
Over here.
Firehouse Museum report?
Firehouse Museum, we're gearing up for reopening May 1st, and we've been working with the city on some repair projects during the winter and on changing some of our displays around. So if you've been in there in the past, when you come in the next time, you may see some things that are changed around a little bit. Sometimes the museum's a little static and the displays haven't changed for years, so you may be pleasantly surprised. And if you want to get a taste of what we're doing, if you go into the Cyril's at the History Center, two of my docents have just finished putting together 2 display cases showcasing just a little bit of what we have at the museum.
Okay, I don't see anybody from the
room. And we open May 1st, Wednesdays through Sunday, 1 to 4.
Thanks, Kathy. I don't see anybody from the Railroad Museum or the Planning Museum here to report. So, upcoming presentations, we have John Rabenkemper, I think you pronounce his name, and Kaylee, next month in April. Tanis Thorne is going to be presented. Where's Tanis?
She's here.
Okay. You want to give us a brief overview of what you're going to talk about?
Hank Niels and I just finished this book, just kind of came out in print about a month ago, and we'll be talking about the Nevada City Nisanon. Next newsletter will have a book review by Mark Selverston in it, and we'd love to have you come and listen to what we have to say on the Nevada City Nisanon.
I heard you had standing room only last night at the book signing.
Yeah, it was a good turn. So. Oh, hi, Dom.
Good.
Dom did a map. It was really good.
Good. We have Gage McKinney back in June. Gage is a frequent presenter here. And then we're going to return to our movie night in July. And we're going to be featuring I forgot the name of the actual film that the Union did. I went and saw it yesterday morning. Was anybody else there? It was at the Sutton Theater. Fabulous production. I mean, the last one I thought was pretty bad, but this one is just absolutely great. And you're going to recognize a few of the people in it. A couple of our own members and board members starred in it. It's a really good production. That'll be July, and we'll be serving popcorn like we have at our prior movie nights. So I think that's about it. I'd like to introduce Gary Noy. He's been here a couple times, I think. Yep, prolific writer. How many books have you penned thus far?
6.
6. No, maybe he's been here 6 times. Retired professor at Sierra College.
Well, not quite.
Not quite. Okay.
I still teach part-time.
Oh, good. All yours.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, I am delighted to be here for a couple of reasons. One is I've given, in the last 10 years, I don't know, 300 and something presentations all over the place. This is only the second time in the last 2.5 years that I've given a presentation before actual people. So I'm delighted with that. And the other reason I'm happy to be here is, I think some of you know this, but I am from Grass Valley. Grass Valley is my hometown. And so I'm always delighted to come back up here to my old stomping grounds. And it's always great to come here, this particular location, because my dad, who worked in the mines, worked in the Empire and the North Star and the Central and all of that, after he left the mines, he became a teacher. And his first teaching job was in the old Nevada City High School, which was right down the street here. And so, used to be down the street. And so it's always great to come back up here. Before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to point out a real influence on tonight's presentation. And that's my friend, Dr. David Beasley, who passed away not too long ago. David and I were colleagues at Sierra College, and his work on the environmental history of the Sierra was a tremendous influence on what I do and what I write about. And I was also delighted that when David retired, he donated all of his research materials to the Sierra College Archives, which I used to run. And it's provided a great resource for myself and for other scholars over the years. And David will be missed. He was a fabulous scholar, and even more importantly, he was a really good guy. And so you'll see his influence, his fingerprints will be in this presentation tonight. Well, let's begin. And what I'm going to be talking about is some of the material from this book, which is available to you back there, Hellacious California. And let me tell you a little bit about how this book came about. I've written a number of other books. Let me bring them up here. A number of other books on Sierra Nevada and Gold Rush and Foothills history. And this is what Mary Ann was asking about. I do have a new book coming out in November. And tonight, you folks get to be the first people to actually see the cover, because I just got it. It's coming out in November, University of Nebraska Press. It's a book on Yosemite. It's an anthology on 19th century Yosemite, which goes into stuff that other books don't go into, like the bloodshed in Yosemite Valley. There's a massive war that took place there. And I think most interestingly, the fact that there were a lot of people who went to Yosemite and hated it, that were overwhelmed by the beauty, but thought everything was overpriced and the drinks were watered down and the food was bad and it smelled bad, and they hated it. And they weren't shy about writing it. You don't see that in other books. And so that's coming out. It's called Nature's Mountain Mansion, which is what John Muir called Yosemite Valley. So that's coming out. So I've written a number of books on the 19th century in California. And it was such a dynamic time period. Huge changes took place. Much of what we see as characteristics, venerated traits of California really have their origins in the 19th century, because it was so intense and so rapid. 6 months was an eternity in 19th century California. Everything turned over. Just think about this. In about a 20-year period, in a generation, California went from being a distant colony of Spain to a largely ignored province of Mexico, to a short-lived independent republic, the Bear Flag Republic, to a military governorship, to what's called a self-governing dominion, which meant there was no law, to statehood, all within about a 20-year period, with different legal systems, different cultural values, and then you layer on top of that the gold rush, which was the largest single migration of people to a single spot for a single purpose in 600 years since the Crusades. Huge changes. All of that was so intense and brought about this venerated change. Something unique happened, though, in California. Because everything changed so rapidly, no traditions were established in 19th century California. Nothing stayed around long enough to become a tradition. And there's a wonderful historian named James Gregory who wrote an essay, a wonderful essay called The Shaping of California History. And he writes about this, and he says there were no traditions established except one, and that one tradition was the tradition of change. Change became a California trait. And so everything we see in California today that's unique and groundbreaking and on the edge of societal change has its origins in 19th century California. So it's very unique. That brings me to the book, Hellacious California. What brought this about? Well, in doing the research for these other books, I discovered something quite interesting, I think. That as I looked at the historical events and the individuals, some very dark elements, very dark history in California, some more quirky and bizarre, I found that there was a common denominator. And the common denominator was, in virtually every case, probably 99% of the time, whenever an event took place or an individual did something that was noteworthy, they were engaged in a vice. They were drinking, or fighting, or smoking, or eating too much, or in criminal activity. And I thought to myself, if it's that critical, why not focus on the vices? So that's what the book is about the vices in 19th century California, drinking and tobacco and fighting and eccentric entertainments and con artists and all of that kind of thing. It's called Hellacious California, the title, because hellacious has two meanings. It depends on how the word is used. Most of the time when people say, well, something is hellacious, they mean something terrible. But if it's used in a different way, it can also mean something remarkable and astonishing. And that word, that one word, encapsulates what I think 19th century California was about. It was simultaneously often awful and astonishing. There were things that happened that were just very unique and groundbreaking, but there were also things that were incredibly dark and deeply troubling. And what I'd like to do for you tonight is just to tell you a few stories about some of these hellacious events and people and tie them to some of the vices. I'm not going to talk about the really dark stuff because it's too depressing, frankly, to talk about. I'm going to talk about some of the quirky kind of things that come to reflect this hellacious California experience. And we're going to start with this story, the story of the woman known as the Confidence Queen. And confidence is a term for a con artist. Well, 19th century California, there's always con artists, there's con artists everywhere, always. The 19th century ones were incredibly brazen. And they just were so open about it and proud and publicly making the public aware of their actions. And one of the best known, kind of one of the consummate con artists of the 19th century was this one, Bertha Heyman, who came to be known as the Confidence Queen. Let me give you a little story of her background. Bertha Heyman was born into a family of con artists. Her father spent many years in prison for forgery and counterfeiting, and Bertha learned at his feet. And she had a criminal record that was longer than both arms. And she was constantly being arrested for forgery or fraud or counterfeiting. She was arrested dozens of times. From all accounts, she was incredibly charming and flirtatious, particularly with older, wealthy men, which made it very successful for her con artistry. Just to give you an example of how frequently she got arrested, there is a story of Bertha that she got arrested for fraud and she went on trial, and the jury reached the verdict, and she stood up to face the jury, and the jury found her not guilty. But before she sat down, the authorities arrested her again for fraud, found her guilty, and she ended up going to prison. She gave a newspaper interview to a prominent New York newspaper, in which she detailed how she conned, how she fleeced these old wealthy guys, and how proud she was of it, and how she considered it a game. She called it an intellectual pursuit. She was very proud of it. Now, I've told you this for a reason. Everything I just told you about Bertha Heyman happened before she came to California and pulled off her most audacious con. She was so prominent that by 1886, this man, Thomas Burns, who is the police chief of New York City, wrote a book called Professional Criminals of America, listing the worst of the worst. And prominently featured was Bertha, with her photograph and a description. This book, by the way, is considered the first use of mugshots in America. It was used earlier in Europe, but this is the first time in America. So in 1886, Bertha Heyman was a very well-known criminal commodity. She was in prison in 1886, and she got out soon afterwards, and she decided to try to plow some new fields. So she left the East Coast, she was New York based, and she came to San Francisco. And in 1888, she arrived in San Francisco with her adult son named Willie, and she started to tell a story that got spread throughout San Francisco. Con artists call it the tale. And the tale she told was, and this is all, of course, none of this is true. She said she was a rich widow, and her husband had bequeathed her hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in today's money would be tens of millions of dollars. So she said she was very wealthy, and she wanted to come and start her life over, so she came to San Francisco. And she let it be known, and she passed her son off, Willie, passed it as her servant. And she spread this tale throughout San Francisco that she was looking for a husband to help her manage her wealth. Her story, her tale was that she was a mere woman, and she had no head for figures, and she needed a man to control all of her wealth. Well, this got a lot of interest. And there were dozens of men who expressed interest in becoming Bertha's husband and managing her vast wealth. Well, we know of at least 20 men who got roped into this scheme. There's probably more, because one of the stocks of the con artist trade is they count on the fact that the people who get taken don't report it because they're so embarrassed. So we know at least 20 who were involved, and this was the scheme. Bertha said, well, there's so much interest, I'm going to have to interview the men to find out which one is suited to be my husband. And just so I know, she said, just so I know that you are a man of means, and that you have your own resources and you're skilled in finances, here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to put up some money up front. Some serious, earnest money. And it could be thousands to tens of thousands, which would be hundreds of thousands of dollars today. And if I don't choose you, if I interview you and I don't choose you as a husband, I will match it from my vast wealth. And I will give it to charity, which he had, of course, no intention of doing. So at least 20 men got roped into this. And Willie and Bertha had hundreds of thousands of dollars, which would be millions and millions of dollars in today's money. Meanwhile, while this scheme's going on, Bertha's living it up. She's staying in the most expensive hotel, she's buying expensive jewelry, most expensive dresses, and she's telling the shopkeepers and hotel keepers, just put it on my tab. And when my finances get all straightened out, I'll pay you off. Of course, she had no intention of doing that. Well, this scheme went on for a few weeks, until finally one day, Willie and Bertha were gone. They just disappeared. And a few of the men, many were embarrassed and didn't report it, but a few of the men reported Bertha and Willie to the authorities, and it started a nationwide hunt for them. They were finally found in Texas, thanks to this photograph. Thanks to this photograph. And they were brought back to San Francisco to be on trial for fraud. It was a sensational trial. They were the celebrity prisoners of the early 1890s. And the trial had huge crowds that came. So crowded, in fact, that this newspaper article of the time period mentions that the judge had to fight his way through the crowd to get to the bench. The trial took place, the jury reached its verdict, and they announced the verdict. Willie, the son, was found guilty. But Bertha, mastermind of the whole thing, was found not guilty. They interviewed the jurors, all male, afterwards, and they said, how come you found her not guilty? And to a man, they said, she could not have possibly done it. She's such a sweet, delightful, charming young woman. She conned the jurors. So what happens to Bertha? Well, Bertha claims that now she's so famous, she's notorious, that she can't do con artistry anymore, and she's moved away from that, although a lot of people think she still did it. She uses her celebrity and notoriety by going on the stage, and she fancies herself an actress, but from all accounts she was just awful. But she was a celebrity, and she had notoriety. So audiences flocked to see her, and she made a small fortune from this. She was one of those people, we have them in our own lives, a no-talent celebrity who was famous for being famous. That was Bertha Heyman. She used her wealth, ultimately, to purchase a whole string of saloons throughout the American West. That's a hellacious story. That's both awful and astonishing at the same time. And it also highlights the fact that the legal system was just kind of crazy in California, particularly in the beginning. Which leads me to a story. I put this in especially for you all tonight, because this is a figure who was rather prominent in Nevada County. At the turn of the gold rush, when statehood started, there was very little law. It was a self-governing dominion, which meant that basically you made up your own rules. Almost all of the law was local law or claim law. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. But the legal system was virtually non-existent for about 18 months at the beginning of the gold rush. And this man, Elisha Crosby, who was a lawyer and a prominent politician at the time, said of California in 1849, he said, in fact, there was very little law of any kind, very few courts, and almost no legal proceedings. People made it up as they went along. But this caused a problem for lawyers in California, and there were a number of them, because they had come for the gold rush. They had come to be miners, but they failed, as did most people during the gold rush. And when they turned to their former profession, there was nothing for them to do, because there was no legal system to speak of. Which leads to my most interesting couple of events. One takes place in San Francisco in 1850. And there, as San Francisco starts to grow, there is a freight company owner by the name of John McClin. He has a wagon and a mule, and he delivers stuff. And he's doing pretty well. In the hyper-inflated economy of Gold Rush San Francisco, he decides to expand. So he's going to get a second wagon and a second mule and deliver more stuff. He writes to his mother back in New York, John McClin does, and he writes this about who he hires. He said, "We have today hired a lawyer to drive a mule team. that is all the use that lawyers are out here. We pay them $175 a month, which in today's money would be about $6,000 a month, so pretty significant pay. So we pay him, we hired this lawyer to drive the mule team. When you meet Judge White, he writes to his mother, when you meet Judge White, tell him this. And McGlynn's mother replies in a letter, and she says, I saw Judge White today, and I told him what you said. And he told me to say that to you, that he, as a lawyer, must say you could not have done better in the selection of a mule driver. For the whole business of a lawyer is to know how to manage mules and asses and make them pay. So it was very quirky legal system in the beginning. And this is where Francis J. Dunn comes in. He is mentioned in virtually every county history in the foothills and the Sierra from the 1850s and 60s period, the whole gold rush era. But he spent a lot of time, did a lot of work in Nevada County. And Francis J. Dunn became renowned for the fact that he was very theatrical and very dramatic, pretty eccentric, and he was famous, infamous, for in court, when the other lawyer would make an argument, Francis J. Dunn would always make a response. He'd always say something, even if it was irrelevant. And so, in one famous court case, this may have taken place in Nevada County. It's listed in one of the Nevada County histories. An opposing lawyer gave an argument in court, and Francis J. Dunn, of course, popped up to give a response. And he was very dramatic and theatrical. And he said this, he replied to the argument, and I'll try to do this as theatrically as Francis J. Dunn. He said, the remarks of counsel, said Dunn, the remarks of counsel remind me of a quotation from a classical poet. I cannot recall the name of the poet, and I've forgotten the quotation. But if I could recall it, the court would see it as appropriate. And he sent him. This was the nature of the legal system. And it even became expressed even more minimalist in the fact that most law during the gold rush era was what was called claim law, in which a mining claim or a mining camp would make their own rules and regulations. It was very, very common during the, let me go through the images here because I forgot to do that. Most of the lawyers of the time period practiced in courthouses like this. This is a beautiful Mariposa County courthouse, which still looks like this and is still used. This is what it looks like today in the Mariposa County courthouse. It's like going back in time. And this is an image of representing Francis J. Dunn, not recalling the name of a classical poet. Well, back to claim law. It was very common during the gold rush era that when people first came out here, they oftentimes formed what were called joint stock companies or mutual associations. This happened back east quite a bit, in which communities would gather together, the men of a community would decide to come to California all together, and they would form a mining camp, and the community would invest in the company, buy stock in order to buy equipment and to pay the passage. And the workers, the miners, once they got to a mining camp, would establish their community, their mining community, and they'd share and share alike, and the people with the most stock would get the greatest revenue from the gold that was found. It was very common. Well, one of the most documented of these joint stock companies was on the middle fork of the American River. In the middle fork of the American River, there was a miner by the name of Tom Buckner. And Tom Buckner, let's see what we got here. We'll get back to him in a second. Tom Buckner had a joint stock company, and they formed a company on the middle fork up at two locations. One was called Buckner's Bar, and the other was called Murderer's Bar. And it was a rich part of the American River. If you've ever been in that part of the world, the confluence is where you go over the bridge over the river and up the middle fork. It's pretty wild today, and there's not many people there. Well, at the time of Buckner's Bar functioning, there were 10,000 miners there. It was a huge community. And Buckner wanted to connect Buckner's Bar and Burger's Bar with the canal so that it would make it easier to travel and to do the mining. It would end up looking something like this. Well, these joint stock companies, because they were using the community's money, usually had rules. And the rules were, if you lived in this community and you're part of the company, you couldn't drink, you couldn't smoke, couldn't fight, couldn't gamble, because all of that would keep you from doing your job. And if you violated these conditions,